Chapter 25. Once more on the boat, and in the presence of others, Archer felt a tranquillity of spirit that surprised as much as it sustained him. The day, according to any current valuation, had been a rather ridiculous failure. He had not so much as touched Madame Olenska's hand with his lips, or extracted one word from her that gave promise of further opportunities. Nevertheless, for a man sick with unsatisfied love, and parting for an indefinite period from the object of his passion, he felt himself almost humiliatingly calm and comforted. It was the perfect balance she had held between their loyalty to others and their honesty to themselves that had so stirred and yet tranquilized him. A balance not artfully calculated, as her tears and her falterings showed, but resulting naturally from her unabashed sincerity. It filled him with a tender awe, now the danger was over, and made him thank the fates that no personal vanity, no sense of playing a part before sophisticated witnesses, had tempted him to tempt her. Even after they had clasped hands for goodbye at the Fall River station, and he had turned away alone, the conviction remained with him of having saved out of their meeting much more than he had sacrificed. He wandered back to the club and went and sat alone in the deserted library, turning and turning over in his thoughts every separate second of their hours together. It was clear to him, and it grew more clear under closer scrutiny, that if she should finally decide on returning to Europe, returning to her husband, it would not be because her old life tempted her, even on the new terms offered. No, she would go, only if she felt herself becoming a temptation to Archer, a temptation to fall away from the standard they had both set up. Her choice would be to stay near him as long as he did not ask her to come nearer, and it depended on himself to keep her just there, safe but secluded. In the train these thoughts were still with him. They enclosed him in a kind of golden haze, through which the faces about him looked remote and indistinct. He had a feeling that if he spoke to his fellow travelers, they would not understand what he was saying. In this state of abstraction he found himself, the following morning, waking to the reality of a stifling September day in New York. The heat-withered faces in the long train streamed past him, and he continued to stare at them through the same golden blur. But suddenly, as he left the station, one of the faces detached itself, came closer, and forced itself upon his consciousness. It was, he instantly recalled, the face of the young man he had seen the day before, passing out of the Parker house, and had noted as not conforming to type, as not having an American hotel face. The same thing struck him now, and again he became aware of a dim stir of former associations. The young man stood looking about him, with the dazed air of the foreigner flung upon the harsh mercies of American travel. Then he advanced towards Archer, lifted his hat, and said in English, "Surely, monsieur, we met in London?" "Ah, to be sure, in London!" Archer grasped his hand with curiosity and sympathy. "So you did get here, after all," he exclaimed, casting a wondering eye on the astute and haggard little countenance of young Carfry's French tutor. "Oh, I got here, yes," Monsieur Riviere smiled with drawn lips. "But not for long. I return the day after tomorrow." He stood grasping his light valise in one neatly gloved hand, and gazing anxiously, perplexedly, almost appealingly into Archer's face. "I wonder, monsieur, since I've had the good luck to run across you, if I might— I was just going to suggest it. Come to luncheon, won't you? Downtown, I mean. If you'll look me up in my office, I'll take you to a very decent restaurant in that quarter." Monsieur Riviere was visibly touched and surprised. "You're too kind, but I was only going to ask if you would tell me how to reach some sort of conveyance. There are no porters, and no one here seems to listen. I know, our American stations must surprise you. When you ask for a porter, they give you chewing gum. But if you'll come along, I'll extricate you, and you really must lunch with me, you know." The young man, after a just perceptible hesitation, replied with profuse thanks, and in a tone that did not carry complete conviction, that he was already engaged. But when they had reached the comparative reassurance of the street, he asked if he might call that afternoon. Archer, at ease in the midsummer leisure of the office, fixed an hour and scribbled his address, which the Frenchman pocketed with reiterated thanks and a wide flourish of his hat. A horse-car received him, and Archer walked away. Punctually at the hour, Monsieur Riviere appeared, shaved, smoothed out, but still unmistakably drawn and serious. Archer was alone in his office, and the young man, before accepting the seat he preferred, began abruptly, "I believe I saw you, sir, yesterday in Boston." The statement was insignificant enough, and Archer was about to frame an assent when his words were checked by something mysterious yet illuminating in his visitor's insistent gaze. "It is extraordinary, very extraordinary," Monsieur Riviere continued, "that we should have met in the circumstances in which I find myself." "What circumstances?" Archer asked, wondering a little crudely if he needed money. Monsieur Riviere continued to study him with tentative eyes. "I have come, not to look for employment as I spoke of doing when we last met, but on a special mission." "Ah!" Archer exclaimed. In a flash the two meetings had connected themselves in his mind. He paused to take in the situation thus suddenly lighted up for him, and Monsieur Riviere also remained silent, as if aware that what he had said was enough. "A special mission," Archer at length repeated. The young Frenchman, opening his palms, raised them slightly, and the two men continued to look at each other across the office desk, till Archer roused himself to say, "Do sit down," whereupon Monsieur Riviere bowed, took a distant chair, and again waited. "It was about this mission that you wanted to consult me?" Archer finally asked. Monsieur Riviere bent his head. "Not in my own behalf. On that score I have fully dealt with myself. I should like, if I may, to speak to you about the Countess Olenska." Archer had known for the last few minutes that the words were coming. But when they came, they sent the blood rushing to his temples as if he'd been caught by a bent-back branch in a thicket. "And on whose behalf," he said, "do you wish to do this?" Monsieur Riviere met the question sturdily. "Well, I might say on hers, if it did not sound like a liberty. Shall I say instead, on behalf of abstract justice?" Archer considered him ironically. "In other words, you are Count Olenski's messenger." He saw his blush more darkly reflected in Monsieur Riviere's sallow countenance. "And not to you, monsieur. If I come to you, it is on quite other grounds." "What right have you in the circumstances to be on any other ground?" Archer retorted. "If you are an emissary, you're an emissary." The young man considered. "My mission is over. As far as the Countess Olenska goes, it has failed." "I can't help that," Archer rejoined on the same note of irony. "No, but you can help." Monsieur Riviere paused, turned his hat about in his still carefully gloved hands, looked into its lining, and then back at Archer's face. "You can help, monsieur, I am convinced, to make it equally a failure with her family." Archer pushed back his chair and stood up. "Well, and by God I will!" he exclaimed. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring down wrathfully at the little Frenchman, whose face, though he too had risen, was still an inch or two below the line of Archer's eyes. Monsieur Riviere paled to his normal hue. Paler than that his complexion could hardly turn. "Why the devil," Archer explosively continued, "should you have thought, since I suppose you are appealing to me on the grounds of my relationship to Madame Olenska, that I should take a view contrary to the rest of her family?" The change of expression in Monsieur Riviere's face was, for a time, his only answer. His look passed from timidity to absolute distress. For a young man of his usually resourceful mien, it would have been difficult to appear more disarmed and defenseless. "Oh, monsieur, I can't imagine," Archer continued, "why you should have come to me when there are others so much nearer to the Countess. Still less why you thought I should be more accessible to the arguments I suppose you were sent over with." Monsieur Riviere took this onslaught with a disconcerting humility. "The arguments I want to present to you, monsieur, are my own, and not those I was sent over with." "Then I see still less reason for listening to them." Monsieur Riviere again looked into his hat, as if considering whether these last words were not a sufficiently broad hint to put it on and be gone. Then he spoke with sudden decision. "Monsieur, will you tell me one thing? Is it my right to be here that you question, or do you perhaps believe the whole matter to be already closed?" His quiet insistence made Archer feel the clumsiness of his own bluster. Monsieur Riviere had succeeded in imposing himself. Archer, reddening slightly, dropped into his chair again and signed to the young man to be seated. "I beg your pardon, but why isn't the matter closed?" Monsieur Riviere glanced back at him with anguish. "You do, then, agree with the rest of the family that, in the face of the new proposals I have brought, it is hardly possible for Madame Olenska not to return to her husband?" "Good God!" Archer exclaimed, and his visitor gave out a low murmur of confirmation. "Before seeing her I saw, at Count Olenski's request, Mr. Lovell Mingott, with whom I had several talks before going to Boston. I understand that he represents his mother's view, and that Mrs. Manson Mingott's influence is great throughout her family." Archer sat silent, with the sense of clinging to the edge of a sliding precipice. The discovery that he had been excluded from a share in these negotiations, and even from the knowledge that they were on foot, caused him a surprise hardly dulled by the acuter wonder of what he was learning. He saw in a flash that if the family had ceased to consult him, it was because some deep tribal instinct warned them that he was no longer on their side. And he recalled, with a start of comprehension, a remark of May's during their drive home from Mrs. Manson Mingott's on the day of the archery meeting. Perhaps, after all, Ellen would be happier with her husband. Even in the tumult of his new discoveries, Archer remembered his indignant exclamation, and the fact that since then his wife had never named Madame Olenska to him. Her careless allusion had no doubt been the straw held up to see which way the wind blew. The result had been reported to the family, and thereafter Archer had been tacitly omitted from their councils. He admired the tribal discipline, which made May bow to this decision. She would not have done so, he knew, had her conscience protested, but she probably shared the family view that Madame Olenska would be better off as an unhappy wife than as a separated one, and that there was no use in discussing the case with Newland, who had an awkward way of suddenly not seeming to take the most fundamental things for granted. Archer looked up and met his visitor's anxious gaze. "Don't you know, monsieur? Is it possible you don't know? That the family began to doubt if they have the right to advise the Countess to refuse her husband's last proposals." "The proposals you brought." "The proposals I brought." It was on Archer's lips to exclaim that whatever he knew or did not know was no concern of Monsieur Riviere's, but something in the humble and yet courageous tenacity of Monsieur Riviere's gaze made him reject this conclusion, and he met the young man's question with another. "What is your object in speaking to me of this?" He had not to wait a moment for the answer. "To beg you, monsieur, to beg you with all the force I am capable of, not to let her go back." "Oh, don't let her!" Monsieur Riviere exclaimed. Archer looked at him with increasing astonishment. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his distress or the strength of his determination. He had evidently resolved to let everything go by the board, but the supreme need of thus putting himself on record. Archer considered. "May I ask," he said at length, "if this is the line you took with the Countess Olenska?" Monsieur Riviere reddened, but his eyes did not falter. "No, monsieur. I accepted my mission in good faith. I really believed, for reasons I need not trouble you with, that it would be better for Madame Olenska to recover her situation, her fortune, the social consideration that her husband's standing gives her." "So I suppose you could hardly have accepted such a mission otherwise. I should not have accepted it." "Well, then—" Archer paused again, and their eyes met in another protracted scrutiny. "Ah, monsieur, after I had seen her, after I had listened to her, I knew she was better off here." "You knew—" "Monsieur, I discharged my mission faithfully. I put the Count's arguments, I stated his offers, without adding any comment of my own. The Countess was good enough to listen patiently. She carried her goodness so far as to see me twice. She considered impartially all I had come to say, and it was in the course of these 2 talks that I changed my mind, that I came to see things differently." "May I ask what led to this change?" "Simply seeing the change in her," Monsieur Riviere replied. "The change in her? Then you knew her before?" The young man's colour again rose. "I used to see her in her husband's house. I have known Count Olenski for many years. You can imagine that he would not have sent a stranger on such a mission." Archer's gaze, wandering away to the blank walls of the office, rested on a hanging calendar surmounted by the rugged features of the President of the United States. That such a conversation should be going on anywhere within the millions of square miles, subject to his rule, seemed as strange as anything the imagination could invent. "The change? What sort of change?" "Oh, monsieur, if I could tell you—" Monsieur Riviere paused. "Tenez, the discovery, I suppose, of what I'd never thought of before, that she's an American, and that if you're an American of her kind, of your kind, things that are accepted in certain other societies, or at least put up with as part of a general convenient give and take, become unthinkable, simply unthinkable. If Madame Olenska's relations understood what these things were, their opposition to her returning would no doubt be as unconditional as her own. But they seem to regard her husband's wish to have her back as proof of an irresistible longing for domestic life." Monsieur Riviere paused and then added, "Whereas it's far from being as simple as that." Archer looked back to the President of the United States and then down at his desk and the papers scattered on it. For a second or two he could not trust himself to speak. During this interval he heard Monsieur Riviere's chair pushed back, and was aware that the young man had risen. When he glanced up again, he saw that his visitor was as moved as himself. "Thank you," Archer said simply. "There is nothing to thank me for, monsieur. It is I, rather." Monsieur Riviere broke off, as if speech for him, too, were difficult. "I should like, though," he continued in a firmer voice, "to add one thing. You asked me if I was in Count Olenski's employ. I am at this moment. I returned to him a few months ago for reasons of private necessity, such as may happen to anyone who has persons, ill and older persons, dependent on him. But from the moment that I have taken the step of coming here to say these things to you, I consider myself discharged, and I shall tell him so on my return, and give him the reasons. That's all, monsieur." Monsieur Riviere bowed and drew back a step. "Thank you," Archer said again, and their hands met. Chapter 26. Every year on the 15th of October, Fifth Avenue opened its shutters, unrolled its carpets, and hung up its triple layer of window curtains. By the 1st of November, this household ritual was over, and society had begun to look about and take stock of itself. By the 15th, the season was in full blast. Opera and theatres were putting forth their new attractions. Dinner engagements were accumulating, and dates for dances being fixed. And, punctually at about this time, Mrs. Archer always said that New York was very much changed. Observing it from the lofty standpoint of a non-participant, she was able, with the help of Mr. Sillerton Jackson and Miss Sophie, to trace each new crack in its surface, and all the strange weeds pushing up between the ordered rows of social vegetables. It had been one of the amusements of Archer's youth to wait for this annual pronouncement of his mother's, and to hear her enumerate the minute signs of disintegration that his careless gaze had overlooked. For New York, to Mrs. Archer's mind, never changed without changing for the worse, and in this view Miss Sophie Jackson heartily concurred. Mr. Sillerton Jackson, as became a man of the world, suspended his judgment, and listened with an amused impartiality to the lamentations of the ladies. But even he never denied that New York had changed. And Newland Archer, in the winter of the second year of his marriage, was himself obliged to admit that, if it had not actually changed, it was certainly changing. These points had been raised, as usual, at Mrs. Archer's Thanksgiving dinner. At the date when she was officially enjoined to give thanks for the blessings of the year, it was her habit to take a mournful, though not embittered, stock of her world, and wonder what there was to be thankful for. At any rate, not the state of society. Society, if it could be said to exist, was rather a spectacle on which to call down biblical imprecations. And in fact everyone knew what the Reverend Dr. Ashmore meant when he chose a text from Jeremiah, chapter 2, verse 25, for his Thanksgiving sermon. Dr. Ashmore, the new rector of St. Matthew's, had been chosen because he was very advanced. His sermons were considered bold in thought and novel in language. When he fulminated against fashionable society, he always spoke of its trend. And to Mrs. Archer it was terrifying and yet fascinating to feel herself part of a community that was trending. "There's no doubt that Dr. Ashmore is right. There is a marked trend," she said, as if it were something visible and measurable, like a crack in a house. It was odd, though, to preach about it on Thanksgiving, Miss Jackson opened, and her hostess dryly rejoined, "Oh, he means us to give thanks for what's left." Archer had been wont to smile at these annual vaticinations of his mother's, but this year even he was obliged to acknowledge, as he listened to an enumeration of the changes, that the trend was visible. "The extravagance in dress," Miss Jackson began. Sillerton took me to the first night of the opera, and I can only tell you that Jane Mary's dress was the only one I recognized from last year, and even that had had the front panel changed. Yet I know she got it out from Worth only 2 years ago, because my seamstress always goes in to make over her Paris dresses before she wears them. "Oh, Jane Mary is one of us," said Mrs. Archer, sighing, as if it were not such an enviable thing to be in an age when ladies were beginning to flaunt abroad their Paris dresses as soon as they were out of the custom-house, instead of letting them mellow under lock and key, in the manner of Mrs. Archer's contemporaries. "Yes, she's one of the few. In my youth," Mrs. Jackson rejoined, "it was considered vulgar to dress in the newest fashions, and Amy Sillerton has always told me that in Boston the rule was to put away one's Paris dresses for 2 years. Old Mrs. Baxter Pennilow, who did everything handsomely, used to import 12 a year, 2 velvet, 2 satin, 2 silk, and the other 6 of poplin and the finest cashmere. It was a standing order, and as she was ill for 2 years before she died, they found 48 Worth dresses that had never been taken out of tissue paper, and when the girls left off their mourning, they were able to wear the first lot at the symphony concerts without looking in advance of the fashion. Ah, well, Boston is more conservative than New York, but I always think it's a safe rule for a lady to lay aside her French dresses for 1 season," Mrs. Archer conceded. "It was Beaufort who started the new fashion by making his wife clap her new clothes on her back as soon as they arrived. I must say, at times it takes all Regina's distinction not to look like... Miss Jackson glanced around the table, caught Janie's bulging gaze, and took refuge in an unintelligible murmur. "Like her rivals," said Mr. Sillerton Jackson, with the air of producing an epigram. "Oh, the ladies murmured, and Mrs. Archer added, partly to distract her daughter's attention from forbidden topics, "Poor Regina. Her Thanksgiving hasn't been a very cheerful one, I'm afraid. Have you heard the rumors about Beaufort's speculations, Sillerton?" Mr. Jackson nodded carelessly. Everyone had heard the rumors in question, and he scorned to confirm a tale that was already common property. A gloomy silence fell upon the party. No one really liked Beaufort, and it was not wholly unpleasant to think the worst of his private life, but the idea of his having brought financial dishonor on his wife's family was too shocking to be enjoyed even by his enemies. Archer's New York tolerated hypocrisy in private relations, but in business matters it exacted a limp and impeccable honesty. It was a long time since any well-known banker had failed discreditably, but everyone remembered the social extinction visited on the heads of the firm when the last event of the kind had happened. It would be the same with the Beauforts, in spite of his power and her popularity. Not all the leagued strength of the Dallas connection would save poor Regina if there were any truth in the reports of her husband's unlawful speculations. The talk took refuge in less ominous topics, but everything they touched on seemed to confirm Mrs. Archer's sense of an accelerated trend. "Of course, Newland, I know you let dear May go to Mrs. Struthers' Sunday evenings," she began. And May interposed gaily, "Oh, you know everybody goes to Mrs. Struthers's now, and she was invited to Granny's last reception." It was thus, Archer reflected, that New York managed its transitions, conspiring to ignore them till they were well over, and then, in all good faith, imagining that they had taken place in a preceding age. There was always a traitor in the citadel, and after he, or generally she, had surrendered the keys, what was the use of pretending that it was impregnable? Once people had tasted of Mrs. Struthers' easy Sunday hospitality, they were not likely to sit at home, remembering that her champagne was transmuted shoe polish. "I know, dear, I know," Mrs. Archer sighed. "Such things have to be, I suppose, as long as amusement is what people go out for, but I've never quite forgiven your cousin, Madame Olenska, for being the first person to countenance Mrs. Struthers." A sudden blush rose to young Mrs. Archer's face. It surprised her husband as much as the other guests about the table. "Oh, Ellen," she murmured, much in the same accusing yet deprecating tone in which her parents might have said, "Oh, the Blenkers." It was the note on which the family had taken to sounding on the mention of Countess Olenska, since she had surprised and inconvenienced them by remaining obdurate to her husband's advances. But on May's lips it gave food for thought, and Archer looked at her with a sense of strangeness that sometimes came over him when she was most in the tone of her environment. His mother, with less than her usual sensitiveness to atmosphere, still insisted, "I've always thought that people like the Countess Olenska, who have lived in aristocratic societies, ought to help us keep up our social distinctions, instead of ignoring them." May's blush remained permanently vivid. It seemed to have a significance beyond that implied by the recognition of Madame Olenska's social bad faith. "I've no doubt we all seem alike to foreigners," said Miss Jackson tartly. "I don't think Ellen cares for society, but nobody knows exactly what she does care for," May continued, as if she had been groping for something non-committal. "Ah, well," Mrs. Archer sighed again. Everybody knew that the Countess Olenska was no longer in the good graces of her family. Even her devoted champion, old Mrs. Manson Mingott, had been unable to defend her refusal to return to her husband. The Mingotts had not proclaimed their disapproval aloud. Their sense of solidarity was too strong. They had simply, as Mrs. Welland said, let poor Ellen find her own level. And that, mortifyingly and incomprehensibly, was in the dim depths where the Blenkers prevailed, and people who wrote celebrated their untidy rights. It was incredible, but it was a fact, that Ellen, in spite of all her opportunities and her privileges, had become simply bohemian. The fact enforced the contention that she had made a fatal mistake in not returning to Count Olenski. After all, a young woman's place was under her husband's roof, especially when she had left it in circumstances that, well, if one had cared to look into them. "Madame Olenska is a great favourite with the gentlemen," said Miss Sophie, with her air of wishing to put forth something conciliatory when she knew that she was planting a dart. "Oh, that's the danger that a young woman like Madame Olenska is always exposed to," Mrs. Archer mournfully agreed. And the ladies on this conclusion gathered up their trains to seek the carcel globes of the drawing-room, while Archer and Mr. Sillerton Jackson withdrew to the Gothic library. Once established before the grate, and consoling himself for the inadequacy of the dinner by the perfection of his cigar, Mr. Jackson became portentous and communicable. "If the Beaufort smash comes," he announced, "there are going to be disclosures." Archer raised his head quickly. He could never hear the name without the sharp vision of Beaufort's heavy figure, opulently furred and shod, advancing through the snow at Scoider Cliff. "There's bound to be," Mr. Jackson continued, "the nastiest kind of cleaning up. He hasn't spent all his money on Regina." "Oh, well, that's discounted, isn't it? My belief is he'll pull out yet," said the young man, wanting to change the subject. Perhaps. I know he was to see some of the influential people today." "Of course," Mr. Jackson reluctantly conceded, "it's to be hoped that they can tide him over. This time, anyhow. I shouldn't like to think of poor Regina spending the rest of her life in some shabby foreign watering place for bankrupts." Archer said nothing. It seemed to him so natural, however tragic, that money ill-gotten should be cruelly expiated, and that his mind, hardly lingering over Mrs. Beaufort's doom, wandered back to closer questions. What was the meaning of May's blush? when the Countess Olenska had been mentioned. 4 months had passed since the midsummer day that he and Madame Olenska had spent together, and since then he had not seen her. He knew that she had returned to Washington, to the little house which she and Medora Manson had taken there. He had written to her once, a few words, asking when they were to meet again, and she had even more briefly replied, "Not yet." Since then there had been no further communication between them, and he had built up within himself a kind of sanctuary in which she throned among his secret thoughts and longings. Little by little it became the scene of his real life, of his only rational activities. Thither he brought the books he read, the ideas and feelings which nourished him, his judgments and visions. Outside it, in the scene of his actual life, he moved with a growing sense of unreality and insufficiency, blundering against familiar prejudices and traditional points of view, as an absent-minded man goes on bumping into the furniture of his own room. Absent. That was what he was. So absent from everything most densely real and near to those about him, that it sometimes startled him to find they still imagined he was there. He became aware that Mr. Jackson was clearing his throat, preparatory to further revelations. "I don't know, of course, how far your wife's family are aware of what people say about Madame Olenska's refusal to accept her husband's latest offer." Archer was silent, and Mr. Jackson obliquely continued, "It's a pity. It's certainly a pity that she refused it." "A pity? In God's name, why?" Mr. Jackson looked down his leg to the unwrinkled sock that joined it to a glossy pump. "Well, to put it on the lowest ground, what's she going to live on now?" "Now? If Beaufort—" Archer sprang up, his fist banging down on the black walnut edge of the writing-table. The wells of the brass double inkstand danced in their sockets. "What the devil do you mean, sir?" Mr. Jackson, shifting himself slightly in his chair, turned a tranquil gaze on the young man's burning face. "Well, I have it on pretty good authority, in fact on old Catherine's herself, that the family reduced Countess Olenska's allowance considerably when she definitely refused to go back to her husband. And as, by this refusal, she also forfeits the money settled on her when she married, which Olenska was ready to make over to her if she returned, why, what the devil do you mean, my dear boy, by asking me what I mean?" Mr. Jackson good-humouredly retorted. Archer moved towards the mantelpiece and bent over to knock his ashes into the grate. "I don't know anything of Madame Olenska's private affairs, but I don't need to be certain that what you insinuate—" "Oh, I don't. It's Lefferts, for one," Mr. Jackson interposed. "Lefferts, who made love to her and got snubbed for it," Archer broke out contemptuously. "Oh, did he?" snapped the other, as if this were exactly the fact that he'd been laying a trap for. He still sat sideways from the fire, so that his hard old gaze held Archer's face as if in a spring of steel. Well, it's a pity she didn't go back before Beaufort's cropper," he repeated. "If she goes now, and if he fails, it will only confirm the general impression, which isn't by any means peculiar to Lefferts, by the way. Oh, she won't go back now, less than ever." Archer had no sooner said it than he had once more the feeling that it was exactly what Mr. Jackson had been waiting for. The old gentleman considered him attentively. "That's your opinion, eh? Well, no doubt you know, but everybody will tell you that the few pennies Medora Manson has left are all in Beaufort's hands, and how the two women are to keep their heads above water unless he does, I can't imagine. Of course, Madame Olenska may still soften old Catherine, who's been the most inexorably opposed to her staying, and old Catherine could make her any allowance she chooses, but we all know she hates parting with good money, and the rest of the family have no particular interest in keeping Madame Olenska here." Archer was burning with unavailing wrath. He was exactly in the state when a man is sure to do something stupid, knowing all the while that he is doing it. He saw that Mr. Jackson had been instantly struck by the fact that Madame Olenska's indifference with her grandmother and her other relations were not known to him, and that the old gentleman had drawn his own conclusions as to the reasons for Archer's exclusion from the family councils. This fact warned Archer to go warily, but the insinuations about Beaufort made him reckless. He was mindful, however, if not of his own danger, at least of the fact that Mr. Jackson was under his mother's roof, and consequently his guest. Old New York scrupulously observed the etiquette of hospitality, and no discussion with a guest was ever allowed to degenerate into a disagreement. "Shall we go up and join my mother?" he suggested curtly, as Mr. Jackson's last cone of ashes dropped into the brass ashtray at his elbow. On the drive homeward, May remained oddly silent. Through the darkness, he still felt enveloped in her menacing blush. What its menace meant he could not guess, but he was sufficiently warned by the fact that Madame Olenska's name had evoked it. They went upstairs, and he turned into the library. She usually followed him, but he heard her passing down the passage to her bedroom. "May!" he called out impatiently, and she came back, with a slight glance of surprise at his tone. "This lamp is smoking again. I should think the servants might see that it's kept properly trimmed," he grumbled nervously. "I'm so sorry. It shan't happen again," she answered, in the firm, bright tone she had learned from her mother, and it exasperated Archer to feel that she was already beginning to humour him like a younger Mr. Welland. She bent over to lower the wick, and as the light struck upon her white shoulders and the clear curves of her face, he thought, "How young she is! For what endless years this life will have to go on." He felt with a kind of horror his own strong youth and the bounding blood in his veins. "Look here," he said suddenly, "I may have to go to Washington for a few days. Soon. Next week, perhaps." Her hand remained on the key of the lamp as she turned to him slowly. The heat from its flame had brought back a glow to her face, but it paled as she looked up. "On business?" she asked, in a tone which implied that there could be no other conceivable reason, and that she had put the question automatically, as if merely to finish his own sentence. "On business, naturally. There's a patent case coming up before the Supreme Court." He gave the name of the inventor, and went on furnishing details with all Lawrence Lefferts's practised glibness, while she listened attentively, saying at intervals, "Yes, I see." "The change will do you good," she said simply, when he had finished, "and you must be sure to go and see Ellen," she added, looking him straight in the eyes with her cloudless smile, and speaking in a tone she might have employed in urging him not to neglect some irksome family duty. It was the only word that passed between them on the subject, but in the code in which they had both been trained it meant, "Of course you understand that I know all that people have been saying about Ellen, and I heartily sympathize with my family in their effort to get her to return to her husband. I also know that, for some reason, you have not chosen to tell me, you have advised her against this course, which all the older men of the family, as well as our grandmother, agree in approving, and that it is owing to your encouragement that Ellen defies us all, and exposes herself to the kind of criticism which Mr. Sillerton Jackson probably gave you this evening. The hint that has made you so irritable. Hints have indeed not been wanting, but since you appear unwilling to take them from others, I offer you this one myself, in the only form in which well-bred people of our kind can communicate unpleasant things to each other, by letting you understand that I know you mean to see Ellen when you are in Washington, and are perhaps going there expressly for that purpose, and that since you are sure to see her, I wish you to do so with my full and explicit approval, and take the opportunity of letting her know what the course of conduct you have encouraged her in is likely to lead to." Her hand was still on the key of the lamp when the last word of this mute message reached him. She turned the wick down, lifted off the globe, and breathed on the sulky flame. "They smell less if one blows them out," she explained, with her bright housekeeping air. On the threshold, she turned and paused for his kiss. Chapter 27. Wall Street, the next day, had more reassuring reports of Beaufort's situation. They were not definite, but they were hopeful. It was generally understood that he could call on powerful influences in case of emergency, and that he had done so with success. And that evening, when Mrs. Beaufort appeared at the opera, wearing her old smile and a new emerald necklace, society drew a breath of relief. New York was inexorable in its condemnation of business irregularities. So far, there had been no exception to its tacit rule that those who broke the law of probity must pay, and everyone was aware that even Beaufort and Beaufort's wife would be offered up unflinchingly to this principle. But to be obliged to offer them up would be not only painful, but inconvenient. The disappearance of the Beauforts would leave a considerable void in their compact little circle, and those who were too ignorant or too careless to shudder at the moral catastrophe bewailed in advance the loss of the best ballroom in New York. Archer had definitely made up his mind to go to Washington. He was waiting only for the opening of the lawsuit of which he had spoken to May, so that its date might coincide with that of his visit. But on the following Tuesday he learned from Mr. Letterblair that the case might be postponed for several weeks. Nevertheless, he went home that afternoon, determined in any event to leave the next evening. The chances were that May, who knew nothing of his professional life and had never shown any interest in it, would not learn of the postponement, should it take place, nor remember the names of the litigants if they were mentioned before her. And at any rate, he could no longer put off seeing Madame Olenska. There were too many things that he must say to her. On the Wednesday morning, when he reached his office, Mr. Letterblair met him with a troubled face. Beaufort, after all, had not managed to tide over. But by setting afloat the rumor that he had done so, he had reassured his depositors, and heavy payments had poured into the bank till the previous evening, when disturbing reports again began to predominate. In consequence, a run on the bank had begun, and its doors were likely to close before the day was over. The ugliest things were being said of Beaufort's dastardly maneuver, and his failure promised to be one of the most discreditable in the history of Wall Street. The extent of the calamity left Mr. Letterblair white and incapacitated. "I've seen bad things in my time, but nothing as bad as this. Everybody we know will be hit, one way or another. And what can be done about Mrs. Beaufort? What can be done about her? I pity Mrs. Manson Mingott as much as anybody. Coming at her age, there's no knowing what effect this affair may have on her. She always believed in Beaufort. She made a friend of him. And then there's the whole Dallas connection. Poor Mrs. Beaufort is related to every one of you. Her only chance would be to leave her husband, yet how can anyone tell her so? Her duty is at his side, and luckily she seems always to have been blind to his private weaknesses." There was a knock, and Mr. Letterblair turned his head sharply. "What is it? I can't be disturbed." A clerk brought in a letter for Archer and withdrew. Recognizing his wife's hand, the young man opened the envelope and read, "Won't you please come uptown as early as you can? Granny had a slight stroke last night. In some mysterious way she found out before anyone else this awful news about the bank. Uncle Lovell is away shooting, and the idea of disgrace has made poor Papa so nervous that he has a temperature and can't leave his room. Mamma needs you dreadfully, and I do hope you can get away at once and go straight to Granny's." Archer handed the note to his senior partner, and a few minutes later was crawling northward in a crowded horse-car, which he exchanged at 14th Avenue for one of the high, staggering omnibuses of the 5th Avenue line. It was after 12 o'clock when this laborious vehicle dropped him at Old Catherine's. The sitting-room window on the ground floor, where she usually throned, was tenanted by the inadequate figure of her daughter, Mrs. Welland, who signed a haggard welcome as she caught sight of Archer, and at the door he was met by May. The hall wore the unnatural appearance peculiar to well-kept houses suddenly invaded by illness. Wraps and furs lay in heaps on the chairs. A doctor's bag and overcoat were on the table, and beside them letters and cards already piled up unheeded. May looked pale, but smiling. Dr. Bencomb, who had just come for the second time, took a more hopeful view, and Mrs. Mingott's dauntless determination to live and get well was already having an effect on her family. May led Archer into the old lady's sitting-room, where the sliding doors opening into the bedroom had been drawn shut, and the heavy yellow damask portieres dropped over them. And here Mrs. Welland communicated to him, in horrified undertones, the details of the catastrophe. It appeared that the evening before something dreadful and mysterious had happened. At about 8 o'clock, just after Mrs. Mingott had finished the game of solitaire that she always played after dinner, the doorbell had rung, and a lady, so thickly veiled that the servants did not immediately recognize her, had asked to be received. The butler, hearing a familiar voice, had thrown open the sitting-room door, announcing Mrs. Julius Beaufort, and had then closed it again on the two ladies. They must have been together, he thought, about an hour. When Mrs. Mingott's bell rang, Mrs. Beaufort had already slipped away unseen, and the old lady, white and vast and terrible, sat alone in her great chair, and signed to the butler to help her into her room. She seemed, at that time, though obviously distressed, in complete control of her body and brain. The mulatto maid put her to bed, brought her a cup of tea as usual, laid everything straight in the room, and went away. But at 3 in the morning the bell rang again, and the two servants, hastening in at this unwonted summons, for old Catherine usually slept like a baby, had found their mistress sitting up against her pillows with a crooked smile on her face, and one little hand hanging limp from its huge arm. The stroke had clearly been a slight one, for she was able to articulate and to make her wishes known, and soon after the doctor's first visit she had begun to regain control of her facial muscles. But the alarm had been great, and proportionately great was the indignation when it was gathered from Mrs. Mingott's fragmentary phrases that Regina Beaufort had come to ask her, incredible effrontery, to back up her husband, see them through, not to desert them, as she called it, in fact, to induce the whole family to cover and condone their monstrous dishonor. "I said to her, honor's always been honor, and honesty, honesty in Manson Mingott's house, and will be till I'm carried out of it feet first," the old woman had stammered into her daughter's ear, in the thick voice of the partly paralyzed. And when she said, "But my name, Auntie, my name's Regina Dallas," I said it was Beaufort when he covered you with jewels, and it's got to stay Beaufort now that he's covered you with shame. So much, with tears and gasps of horror, Mrs. Welland imparted, blanched and demolished by the unwonted obligation of having at last to fix her eyes on the unpleasant and the discreditable. If only I could keep it from your father-in-law. He always says, Augusta, for pity's sake, don't destroy my last illusions. And how am I to prevent his knowing these horrors? The poor lady wailed. After all, Mamma, he won't have seen them, her daughter suggested, and Mrs. Welland sighed. Oh, no, thank heaven he's safe in bed. And Dr. Bencomb has promised to keep him there till poor Mamma is better, and Regina has been got away somewhere. Archer had seated himself near the window, and was gazing out blankly at the deserted thoroughfare. It was evident that he had been summoned rather for the moral support of the stricken ladies than because of any specific aid that he could render. Mr. Lovell Mingott had been telegraphed for, and messages were being dispatched by hand to the members of the family living in New York. And meanwhile there was nothing to do but to discuss in hushed tones the consequences of Beaufort's dishonour and of his wife's unjustifiable action. Mrs. Lovell Mingott, who had been in another room writing notes, presently reappeared and added her voice to the discussion. In their day, the elder ladies agreed, the wife of a man who had done anything disgraceful in business had only one idea: to efface herself, to disappear with him. There was the case of poor Grandmamma Spicer, your great-grandmother May. Of course, Mrs. Welland hastened to add, your great-grandfather's money difficulties were private. Losses at cards, or signing a note for somebody, I never quite knew, because Mamma would never speak of it. But she was brought up in the country because her mother had to leave New York after the disgrace, whatever it was. They lived in the Hudson alone, winter and summer, till Mamma was 16. And it would never have occurred to Grandmamma Spicer to ask the family to countenance her, as I understand Regina calls it, though a private disgrace is nothing compared to the scandal of ruining hundreds of innocent people. Yes, it would be more becoming in Regina to hide her own countenance than to talk about other people's, Mrs. Lovell Mingott agreed. I understand that the emerald necklace she wore at the opera last Friday had been sent on approval from Ball and Black's in the afternoon. I wonder if they'll ever get it back. Archer listened unmoved to the relentless chorus. The idea of absolute financial probity as the first law of a gentleman's code was too deeply ingrained in him for sentimental considerations to weaken it. An adventurer like Lemuel Struthers might build up the millions of his shoe polish on any number of shady dealings, but unblemished honesty was the noblesse oblige of old financial New York. Nor did Mrs. Beaufort's face greatly move Archer. He felt, no doubt, more sorry for her than her indignant relatives. But it seemed to him that the tie between husband and wife, even if breakable in prosperity, should be indissoluble in misfortune. As Mr. Letterblair had said, a wife's place was at her husband's side when he was in trouble. But society's place was not at his side, and Mrs. Beaufort's cool assumption that it was seemed almost to make her his accomplice. The mere idea of a woman's appealing to her family to screen her husband's business dishonor was inadmissible, since it was the one thing that the family, as an institution, could not do. The mulatto maid called Mrs. Lovell Mingott into the hall, and the latter came back in a moment with a frowning brow. She wants me to telegraph for Ellen Olenska. I had written to Ellen, of course, and to Medora, but now it seems that's not enough. I'm to telegraph to her immediately and to tell her that she's to come alone. The announcement was received in silence. Mrs. Welland sighed resignedly, and May rose from her seat and went to gather up some newspapers that had been scattered on the floor. I suppose it must be done, Mrs. Lovell Mingott continued, as if hoping to be contradicted, and May turned back towards the middle of the room. Of course it must be done, she said. Granny knows what she wants, and we must all carry out her wishes. Shall I write the telegram for you, Auntie? If it goes at once, Ellen can probably catch tomorrow morning's train. She pronounced the syllables of the name with peculiar clearness, as if she had tapped on 2 silver bells. Well, it can't go at once. Jasper and the pantry boys are both out with notes and telegrams. May turned to her husband with a smile. But here's Newland, ready to do anything. Will you take the telegram, Newland? There'll be just time before luncheon. Archer rose with a murmur of readiness, and she seated herself at old Catherine's rosewood bonheur de jour and wrote out the message in her large, immature hand. When it was written, she blotted it neatly and handed it to Archer. "What a pity," she said, "that you and Ellen will cross each other on the way. Newland," she added, turning to her mother and aunt, "is obliged to go to Washington about a patent lawsuit that is coming up before the Supreme Court. I suppose Uncle Lovell will be back by tomorrow night, and with Granny improving so much it doesn't seem right to ask Newland to give up an important engagement for the firm, does it?" She paused as if for an answer, and Mrs. Welland hastily declared, "Oh, of course not, darling. Your Granny would be the last person to wish it." As Archer left the room with the telegram, he heard his mother-in-law add, presumably to Mrs. Lovell Mingott, "But why on earth should she make you telegraph for Ellen Olenska?" And May's clear voice rejoin, "Perhaps it's to urge on her again that, after all, her duty is with her husband." The outer door closed on Archer, and he walked hastily away towards the telegraph office.